I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk, trying to decide if the bank balance looked better if I squinted at it when the doorbell rang. It was 11:04 Tuesday morning. Up in the plant rooms, Nero Wolfe was currently engaged in the only activity he considers truly sacred, spending 2 hours with 10,000 orchids and a man named Theodore Horstman. Between 9 and 11, the rest of the world could go to the devil, provided they didn't make too much noise on the way. I went to the front door, checked the one-way glass, and saw a man who looked like he had been assembled from old library paste and expensive tweed. He was clutching a briefcase to his chest, as if it contained the secret to eternal life, or at least a very substantial tax refund. He wasn't just nervous, he was vibrating. I opened the door. "Good morning. If you're selling encyclopedias, we have them. If you're looking for the precinct, it's around the corner." The man didn't blink. "I must see Mr. Nero Wolfe. Immediately. It is a matter of the utmost bibliographical urgency." "Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "He doesn't see anyone without an appointment before lunch, and even then he prefers them to have a checkbook and a damn good reason." "Which one do you have?" "I have both," he gasped. He fumbled with a card. "Arthur Penhaligon, curator of the Sterling Hale Archive." I let him in, partly because he looked like he might collapse on the welcome mat, and partly because the Sterling Hale was a private library uptown that specialized in the kind of dusty papers people pay a fortune to keep in dark rooms. I parked him in the red leather chair and went to tell Fritz to hold off on any mid-morning snacks. At 11 sharp, the elevator groaned and the mountain moved. Wolfe emerged, navigated the hallway with his usual deliberate gait, and settled into his specially reinforced chair behind the desk. He didn't look at Penhaligon, he looked at the mail. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, melodic rumble. "There is a draft." "That's not a draft, it's Mr. Arthur Penhaligon," I said. "He says he has a bibliographical urgency. He also has a card." Wolfe's obsidian eyes shifted to the man in the red chair. He sighed, a sound of profound suffering. "Mr. Penhaligon, I do not like urgency. It suggests a lack of foresight. What is it?" Penhaligon leaned forward, his knuckles white on his briefcase. "Mr. Wolfe, 3 days ago, a fragment of a lost Chaucerian manuscript vanished from our vault. It is priceless. But that is not why I am here. Yesterday the fragment was returned. It was found tucked inside a first edition of the Canterbury Tales in our public gallery." Wolfe poured a glass of beer from the tray Fritz had brought in. "If it was returned, you would have no problem. You have a prankster." "It was not merely returned," Penhaligon whispered. "It was marked. A crimson silk bookmark was placed at the section describing Miller's tale. And on the bookmark, written in what appears to be dried blood, is a date, December 14th, this Friday." Wolfe's fingers tightened on his beer glass. He hates the holiday season, he hates pranks, and he especially hates people who deface historical documents. But more than that, he recognized the date. December 14th was the date of the Sterling Hale's annual endowment gala, the only night of the year when the city's most powerful collectors gathered under one roof. "Dried blood," Wolfe murmured, the word tasting like vinegar in his mouth. A theatrical touch. Why come to me? The police enjoy the theatre. "The police would shut us down," Penhaligon cried. "If the donors think the vault is porous, the endowment vanishes. I need you to find the intruder before Friday, before whatever is planned for that date happens." Wolfe took a long, slow sip of his beer. He looked at the man, then at the checkbook sitting on Penhaligon's knee. "Archie, get the details and tell Fritz that for lunch. I want the omelette aux fines herbes. I have a feeling the next few days will require a very delicate touch." I reached for my notebook. The hook was in. Wolfe hadn't taken the case for Chaucer or the money. He'd taken it because someone had used a bookmark to threaten the order of his world. And in the brownstone, there's only room for one person to issue threats. The following morning, The brownstone on West 35th Street felt less like a private fortress and more like a waiting room for a very expensive asylum. Wolfe had permitted the literati to invade his office for the simple reason that he refused to leave his chair to visit them, and if he was going to solve a mystery involving parchment and blood, he preferred to do it while his feet were firmly planted on his own rug. By 2 o'clock, the room was occupied by 4 individuals who looked like they had been pulled from the various stages of an academic breakdown. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a vast continent of yellow silk and immovable resolve, while I played the role of the observant usher. Arthur Penhaligon had returned, looking even more frayed than the day before. He was accompanied by Julian Vance, the library's primary benefactor, a man with silver hair and a smile that looked like it had been sharpened on a whetstone. Vance sat in the red leather chair with the proprietary air of a man who owned the air he breathed. Next to him was Dr. Elena Thorne, the archive's head of restoration, whose hands were stained with ink and whose eyes darted around the office as if she were looking for an exit or a hidden microphone. Finally, there was Marcus Sterling, the great-grandson of the library's founder, a younger man with a permanent scowl and a suit that cost more than my first 2 years of salary. Wolfe didn't mind the pleasantries. He spent several minutes adjusting a sprig of orchid on his desk before looking up. "The sanctity of a vault is not breached by accident, Mr. Vance," Wolfe began, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the beer bottles on his tray hum. To remove a Chaucerian fragment and return it with a crimson marker requires either a profound knowledge of your security or a total lack of fear regarding its consequences. Which of you is currently feeling fearless? Vance gave a short, sharp laugh. "We aren't here for riddles, Wolfe. We're here because the Sterling Hale archive is a target. The gala is in 3 days. If that bookmark is a threat to donors, I want to know who is holding the pen. My family's reputation is built on the preservation of history, not its desecration. Reputation is often a shroud for less savory things," Wolfe remarked, his eyes shifting to Dr. Thorne. "Doctor, you have the only key to the inner restoration lab where the fragment was being studied, yet you claim you saw nothing. Did the parchment walk out on its own feet?" Elena Thorne went a shade of grey that matched her tweed jacket. I was in the lab until 6. The vault was locked when I left, but safety logs showed a manual bypass at midnight. The code used was the master curator's. "That's Arthur's code." Penhaligon jumped as if he'd been poked with a hot wire. "My code was compromised. I told you, someone must have seen me enter it. I was home in bed. My housekeeper can verify it. Housekeepers are paid for their loyalty as much as their cleaning," I put in from my desk. I was watching Marcus Sterling, who was leaning back with an expression of bored contempt. "What about you, Mr. Sterling? As the heir to the name, you must have a few bypasses of your own. Or maybe you just like the color red." Marcus didn't even look at me. He kept his eyes on Wolfe. "I don't care about Chaucer. It's a piece of dead skin, but I do care about the fact that my great-grandfather's legacy is being turned into a joke. The library is hemorrhaging money, and this little theatrical display is going to scare off the only donors we have left. If someone is trying to sink the archive, they're doing a damn good job." "Hemorrhaging money," Wolfe repeated, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. "A motive as old as the ink on that manuscript. If the archive fails, what happens to the collection, Mr. Sterling? Does it go to the state, or is it liquidated for the benefit of the heirs?" The room went silent. Marcus's scowl deepened, and Julian Vance's smile finally slipped. "That is a private matter, Wolfe," Vance said coldly. "We are here to find an intruder, not to discuss the Sterling Hale bylaws. You are here because you are frightened," Wolfe countered, his voice dropping into a register of cold authority. "You are frightened that the crimson bookmark is not a prank but a confession. A date has been set, December 14th. If I am to prevent a tragedy, I must understand the friction between you, Archie, the list, I handed him the sheet I'd prepared. I had the names, the backgrounds, and a few choice details I'd dug up that morning. Julian Vance was overextended in his shipping ventures. Elena Thorne had been passed over for the directorship twice. Marcus Sterling was a well-known gambler with a penchant for high-stakes poker and low-rent associates, and Arthur Penhaligon was a man who lived for the archive, but who had recently been told his retirement was mandatory. It was a circle of motives, each wrapped in the velvet of a prestigious institution. Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave its customary groan. He hadn't looked at the suspects yet. He was staring at the small silk bookmark Penhaligon had left on his desk. It was a crude thing, but the color was precise, the color of dried blood. "You may all go," Wolfe said suddenly, waving a hand as if he were shooting flies. "Archie will see you to the door. I have no more questions for the moment." "That's it?" Marcus Sterling stood up, looking indignant. "We drove all the way down here for 10 minutes of vague questioning and a lecture on bylaws?" "You drove here to be seen," Wolfe said, not looking up. "And you have been seen. Good day." I led them out, enjoying the look of baffled fury on Marcus's face and the way Julian Vance's silver-headed cane tapped a frantic rhythm on the hallway floor. As the front door closed, the brownstone returned to its natural state of heavy intellectual silence. I went back into the office. Wolfe was staring at the crimson bookmark again. "Well?" I asked, sitting at my desk. "Are we waiting for the gala, or do I start pounding the pavement? I have a feeling Marcus Sterling's poker friends might know something about his interest in Chaucer." "The bookmark is not blood, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice unusually soft. "It is a mixture of iron gall ink and cochineal dye, an archaic recipe. Someone is not just threatening the archive, they are performing a ritual. They want us to look at the past because the present is too ugly to face. Go to the library. I want to know which books were moved besides Chaucer. And Archie, check the basement." A library's secrets are rarely found on the shelves, they are found in the dust beneath them. "Basement," I muttered, grabbing my hat. "Right, because the thief is probably hiding in a crate of old newspapers. I'll be back for dinner, and I'm expecting something better than a silk ribbon on my plate." I walked out into the cold New York afternoon, my mind already running through the names. The invasion of the literati had left a bad taste in the room, the kind that only a long walk and a few sharp questions could wash away. Wolfe was right. The present was getting ugly, and Friday was coming fast. The Sterling Hale Archive was a sprawling limestone mausoleum on East 62nd Street that smelled of vanilla, old dust, and the kind of quiet desperation that only comes from institutions that are running out of money. I arrived just as the late afternoon sun was turning the city a bruised purple, making the marble exterior look even more like a tombstone. I bypassed the main entrance, where a couple of confused-looking researchers were being ushered out by a security guard who looked like he'd rather be at a ball game, and headed for the side door. I had a key that Penhaligon had given me with a trembling hand, and I used it to let myself into the gallery. It was a long, vaulted room with mahogany cases and lighting that was kept low to keep the centuries from eating the ink. The silence was so thick it felt like I was walking through wool. I spent the first hour doing what I call the Goodwin shuffle, which involves walking around a room until the things that don't belong start to shout at you. Wolfe wanted to know about the moved books. In a place like this, books aren't just moved, they are curated, catalogued, and pinned down like rare butterflies. I found the first edition of the Canterbury Tales where the fragment had been returned. It was sitting in a central case, looking regal and innocent. But as I moved toward the back of the gallery, I noticed a gap on a shelf that was supposed to be dedicated to early botanical texts. It was a small gap, maybe 3 inches wide, but in a library that prides itself on precision, it was a missing tooth. I checked the ledger on the nearby lectern and saw that the missing volume was a 17th century treatise on poisonous flora. I took note of that and kept moving. My next stop was the restoration lab, which was tucked behind a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a battleship. Dr. Elena Thorne was there, bent over a microscope with a posture that suggested she was expecting a blow to the back of the head. She didn't look up when I came in, but she knew I was there. The lab air was pungent with the smell of chemicals and old glue. I stood by the door for a minute, watching her hands. They were steady, which was interesting considering how much she had been shaking in Wolfe's office. "You found what you were looking for, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, her voice flat and muffled by a surgical mask. "Or are you just here to see if I'm hiding Chaucer in my lunchbox?" "I'm here for the atmosphere, Doctor," I said, approaching the workbench, "and to ask about the missing book on poisons. It seems someone took a fancy to a 17th century guide on how to kill your neighbors. Any idea who might have a green thumb for that sort of thing?" She stiffened, finally looking up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "That book was removed for cataloguing 6 months ago. It isn't missing, it's in the backlog. If Penhaligon told you otherwise, he's more confused than I thought. This place is crumbling, Mr. Goodwin. We're losing staff, the climate control is failing, and the board is more interested in the gala than the manuscripts. The Crimson Bookmark isn't a threat, it's a symptom of a dying institution, a symptom that uses iron gall ink and cochineal dye," I countered. "That's a very specific recipe." "Wolfe says it's an archaic ritual. Do you teach rituals in the restoration department, or is that a private study?" She didn't answer. She turned back to her microscope, her shoulders hunching. I left her there and headed for the basement. To get to the lower levels of the Sterling Hale, you have to take an elevator that sounds like it was commissioned during the Civil War. The basement was a labyrinth of crates, discarded furniture, and rows upon rows of filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened since the founder died. It was cold, damp, and perfectly suited for a man with a grudge. I started at the far end, near the old coal chutes. It took me another hour, but I eventually found what Wolfe had suspected. Behind a stack of empty archival boxes, I found a small workspace. It wasn't much, just a folding chair and a crate used as a table, but on that table was a glass jar containing a deep red liquid and a tray of silk ribbons. There was also a scrap of paper with the date December 14th, written over and over again in that same cramped, archaic hand. But what really caught my eye was a small silver-headed pin stuck into the wood of the crate. It was the kind of pin used by tailors, or perhaps by someone who liked to attach things to velvet. I heard a floorboard creak above me and froze. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I waited, my hand moving toward the holster under my left arm. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step. Someone was in the basement with me, and they weren't using the elevator. I moved toward the stairs, keeping low and staying in the shadows. I caught a glimpse of a figure moving toward the coal chute, a flash of tweed and a glint of silver hair. It was Julian Vance. He didn't see me. He reached for something near the chute, a small package wrapped in brown paper, and disappeared through a service door that led to the alleyway. I didn't follow him. I went back to the workspace and did a quick inventory. The red liquid was exactly what Wolfe had predicted, cochineal dye. The silk ribbons were identical to the Crimson Bookmark, and tucked under the chair was a ledger that didn't belong to the archive. It was a personal record of debts, a long list of numbers that suggested someone was very far underwater. I recognized the handwriting from the cards Marcus Sterling had been playing with in the office earlier that week. I left the basement and walked back out into the night. The air was freezing, but it felt clean after the library dust. I walked to a drugstore on the corner and used the phone to call the brownstone. Fritz answered and told me that Wolfe was in the dining room and shouldn't be disturbed, which meant he was halfway through a dish that required total concentration. I told Fritz to tell him I had found the kitchen where the bookmarks were being cooked, and that the head chef had silver hair and a very expensive tailor. By the time I caught a cab back to West 35th Street, I was putting the pieces together, and they didn't look like a Chaucerian fragment. They looked like bankruptcy. The gallery of grudges was getting crowded, and Friday was no longer a date on a bookmark, it was a deadline. I entered the office at 8:45, just as Wolfe was finishing his coffee. He looked at me, his eyes half closed, and I knew he didn't need me to say a word to know that the ritual had begun. The present was indeed getting ugly, and the past was being used as a weapon to finish the job. The following morning, New York decided to remind everyone that December is not a month for the faint of heart. The sky was the color of a wet sidewalk, and a wind was whipping off the Hudson that felt like it wanted to peel the skin right off your face. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, likely telling a Miltonia orchid that its symmetry was an insult to his intelligence, while I was at my desk trying to make sense of why a billionaire like Julian Vance would be sneaking around a coal chute in a tweed coat. I had spent the early hours doing a bit of paper chasing, which is like regular hunting but with more dust and less fresh air. I had a list of Marcus Sterling's gambling associates and a growing suspicion that the mystery of the Crimson Bookmark was actually a very elaborate way of moving money from one pocket to another. I spent the first half of the day on the pavement, starting at a small smoky club on West 47th Street, where the stakes are high and the questions are low. A contact of mine, a man named Joey who knows every card sharp in the tri-state area, confirmed that Marcus Sterling hadn't just been losing, he had been hemorrhaging. He owed a sum that made my head swim, and the people he owed it to weren't the type to accept a Chaucerian fragment as a down payment. They wanted cash, and they wanted it by the end of the week. That put Marcus squarely in the frame for a desperate move, but it didn't explain the cochineal die or the archaic ritual. For that, I had to look at the paper. I moved on to the Hall of Records, digging through Sterling Hale's recent filings. The archive was a non-profit, but it was sitting on a mountain of real estate that was worth 10 times the collection. If the endowment failed and the archive was forced to dissolve, the land would revert to the heirs and the primary creditors. And who was the primary creditor? Julian Vance. The silver-haired benefactor wasn't just giving money away, he was essentially holding a mortgage in the past. If the gala on Friday turned into a disaster, say, a high-profile theft or a threat to the donors, the board would have no choice but to declare bankruptcy. Vance would step in, clear the debts, and walk away with a block of Manhattan that was worth a fortune. It was a beautiful piece of pretension, wrapped in the silk of a library ribbon. By 2 o'clock I was back at the brownstone. Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms and was settled in his chair, staring at a bottle of beer with the kind of focus other men give to their firstborn children. He didn't look up when I sat at my desk and tossed my notebook onto the blotter. I waited for him to finish his first glass before I started talking. In the world of Nero Wolfe, timing is everything, and interrupting a man's first beer of the day is a good way to get a lecture on the decline of Western civilization. The pavement is talking, and it has a lot to say about Marcus Sterling, I began, watching him pour the second glass. He's in deep with some very unfriendly people. He needs the archive to fail so he can get his hands on his share of the liquidation. But here's the kicker. Julian Vance is the one holding the strings. I saw him in the basement last night picking up a package. He's the one who's been using the cochineal die. He's not just a benefactor, he's the architect. He's using Marcus's desperation to stage a threat that will drive the donors away and trigger a default. Wolfe sighed. A sound that seemed to come from the building's very foundation. Pretension, Archie. It is the most common of human failings. Mr. Vance wishes to appear as a savior while he acts as a vulture. But the Chaucerian fragment, why return it? If he wanted to damage the archive's reputation, he simply had to let it vanish. Maybe he's not just after the money, I suggested. Maybe he's after the prestige. If he returns the stolen manuscript during the gala, he's the hero of the hour. He gets the land, he gets the praise, and Marcus gets his debts paid. Everyone wins except for the history books. And Dr. Elena Thorne? Wolfe asked, his eyes half closing. How does she fit into this gallery of pretension? She was the one who claimed the bypass was manual. She was the one who pointed the finger at Penhaligon. "She's scared," I said. "I think she knows what's going on, but she's trapped. She's devoted her life to that library, and she's watching it get sold out from under her." "I found a tailor's pin in the basement, Wolfe. The same kind of pin that was on the bookmark. And I saw Vance in that basement. He wasn't there for a tour. He was there because that's where the work is being done." The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that broke the rhythm of the afternoon. I checked the one-way glass and saw Arthur Penhaligon. He looked like he'd been run over by a very large, very slow truck. I let him in, and he practically stumbled into the office, clutching a piece of paper that looked like it had been crumpled and smoothed out a dozen times. "It happened again," he gasped, leaning against the red leather chair for support. "A second bookmark, found in the founder's diary this morning. It doesn't have a date this time, it has a name. It says, 'The Sacrifice of the Scholar.' Mr. Wolfe, I'm afraid, I think someone is going to die on Friday night." Wolfe didn't look at the paper. He looked at Penhaligon, his eyes turning into slits of black light. "A sacrifice. How melodramatic. Pretension is getting tiresome, Mr. Penhaligon. Archie, get Saul Panzer on the phone. I want him at the Sterling, Hale tonight. He is to watch the coal chute, and he is to watch Mr. Vance's private office. And Archie, tell Fritz that for dinner I want the lamb. We are finished with the appetizers. It is time for the main course." I reached for the phone, my mind already running through the possibilities. The pavement had given me the motive, the paper had given me the method, and the pretension was providing the drama. Friday was no longer a deadline, it was a stage, and the actors were already in their places. Wolfe was positioning his pieces, and I had a feeling that by the time the lamb was served, the mystery of the crimson bookmark would have its final bloody chapter. The following morning, the atmosphere in the brownstone was as thick as Fritz's mutton gravy. Saul Panzer had reported at 6 a.m., having spent a cold, cramped night observing the Sterling Hale's service entrance. He hadn't seen Julian Vance return to the coal chute, but he had seen something else, a light burning in the curator's office until nearly dawn, and a courier departing with a heavy rectangular package at 4:15. Wolfe received this news with a grim nod and spent the rest of his morning upstairs with his orchids, leaving me to handle a series of increasingly frantic telephone calls from Julian Vance's secretary. Vance wanted a progress report, which was a polite way of asking if we had found enough evidence to point the finger at anyone other than himself. I told the secretary that Mr. Wolfe's mind was currently occupied by a stubborn phalaenopsis, and that we would be in touch when the logic reached a boiling point. When Wolfe finally descended at 11, he didn't go to his desk. Instead, he stood before the bookshelves that lined the office, his eyes roaming over his own collection of thousands of volumes. He looked like a general inspecting his troops before a decisive battle. I sat at my desk, watching him, wondering if he was looking for a specific precedent, or just enjoying the sight of books that stayed where they were put. Finally, he turned and navigated his way into his chair. He didn't ask for beer. He asked for the notebook I had filled during my visit to the Archives Restoration Lab. "Archie," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant rumble that usually signaled a shift in strategy. "The 17th century treatise on poisonous flora. Dr. Thorne claimed it was in the backlog. You saw a gap on the shelf. In a library of that stature, a displaced volume is not a clerical error. It is a displacement of reality. If the book is not in the lab and not on the shelf, where is it? If I were a betting man, I'd say it's tucked under someone's mattress," I said, leaning back. But the restoration lab didn't look like it had seen a poison manual in months. Elena Thorne was too busy playing the martyr to actually do any cataloguing. What if the book was the sacrifice Penhaligon was babbling about? Wolfe shook his head, a movement so slight it barely disturbed the air. "No, the sacrifice is not an object, it is a person. The crimson bookmark in the founder's diary was a directive. Mr. Vance is not merely an architect of bankruptcy, he is a student of history. He understands that a crime is only memorable if it has a victim that people can mourn. He is planning to return the Chaucer at the gala, yes, but he is also planning to find a culprit to bear the weight of the theft. Someone who can no longer defend themselves. A scholar, I muttered, the pieces starting to click. The sacrifice of the scholar. He's going to frame Penhaligon. The poor old guy's already halfway to a nervous breakdown. It wouldn't take much to make it look like he stole the fragment to save the library, and then took the long way out when the guilt got too much. Precisely, Wolfe said, and the displaced volume of poisons provides the method. A scholar's death, by an archaic substance found within the very walls he sought to protect. It is a narrative of supreme pretension. Mr. Vance does not just want the land, he wants a tragedy that he can survive with grace. But he has made a strategic error. He has assumed that because he owns the archive, he also owns the truth. The doorbell rang again. I checked the one-way glass and saw Marcus Sterling. He looked even more disheveled than he had on Tuesday, his expensive suit wrinkled and his tie askew. I let him in, and he marched into the office, ignoring me and heading straight for Wolfe. He didn't sit. He threw a silver-headed pin onto the desk, the twin to the one I had found in the basement. "I found this in my car this morning," Marcus snapped, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "And I found a crimson ribbon tucked into my steering wheel. Someone is trying to set me up, Wolfe. They know about the debts, they know I need the money. If Penhaligon turns up dead with a bookmark in his pocket, the police are going to come for me first. I didn't do this. I'm a gambler, not a murderer." Wolfe looked at the pin, then Marcus. "You are a fool, Mr. Sterling. You have allowed your desperation to become a tool for a man who is far more patient than you. But you are a useful fool. Archie, take Mr. Sterling into the dining room. Give him a drink and make sure he stays there. He is now a displaced volume in our own collection." I did as I was told, parking Marcus with a bottle of rye and a warning that if he tried to leave I'd have to get physical, which I'd probably enjoy more than he would. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was on the phone. He was talking to Saul Panzer, and he was giving instructions for a very specific kind of trespass. He wanted Saul to enter Julian Vance's private residence. Not to steal anything, but to find the 17th century treatise on poisonous flora. "The gala is tomorrow night," I said after he hung up. "The displacement is almost complete. We've got Marcus in the dining room, Penhaligon in a panic, and Vance thinking he's the hero of the piece. How are you going to move the mountain to the archive, Wolfe? You won't even go to the bank." "I am not going to the archive, Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes turning into slits of black light. "The archive is coming here. Tomorrow night at 6 we will hold our own gala. We will summon the board, curator and restorer. We will provide the final chapter of the Chaucerian fragment. And we will see how Mr. Vance handles a narrative that he did not write." "A gala in the office," I said, a grin starting to spread across my face. "I'll tell Fritz to prepare the appetizers. Should I include any crimson ribbons, or would that be too much for the guests?" "Include nothing but the truth, Archie," Wolfe said, picking up his beer. "It is the only thing in this case that has been truly displaced, and make sure your gun is loaded. When a vulture realizes the carcass is still alive, it tends to get unruly." I spent the rest of the day coordinating with Saul and keeping Marcus Sterling from drinking himself into a stupor. The displacement was nearing its end, and the office was becoming the center of a very dangerous circle. Wolfe was right. The truth was the only thing missing, and tomorrow night we were going to put it back on the shelf, right where it belonged. Saul Panzer arrived at the brownstone at exactly 8:14 p.m., slipping through the service entrance like a breeze that didn't want to wake the neighbors. He looked like any other man you'd pass on the street without a second glance, a bit short, a bit scruffy, and possessed of a face that was designed by nature to be forgotten. But in the world of private detection, Saul was the gold standard. If you asked him to find a needle in a haystack, He'd not only bring you the needle, but tell you the name of the blacksmith who made it. He followed me into the office where Wolfe was waiting, having finished a dinner of poached salmon and currently looking like a man who was ready to hear a confession. Saul didn't waste time with the weather. He sat on the edge of the chair I kept for him and pulled a small leather-bound book from his pocket. It wasn't the 17th century poison manual we were looking for, but it was something far more damning. It was a shadowed ledger, a private record Saul had recovered from a floorboard in Julian Vance's library. Beside it, he laid a small glass vial containing a trace of red liquid. "The book you wanted wasn't in the study, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "It was in the furnace, half burned. I managed to save enough of the index to see that the section on aconite and iron had been heavily annotated, but I found this ledger instead. It's a list of payments made over the last 18 months. It isn't just Marcus Sterling's debts. It's a series of donations made to a private account in Switzerland. The account holder isn't Vance, it's Dr. Elena Thorne." I felt a low whistle build up in my chest, but kept it quiet. Wolfe didn't move a muscle, but his eyes turned into hard, black diamonds. "Elena Thorne," Wolfe murmured. "The head of restoration. The woman claimed the security bypass was manual. She hasn't been passed over for the directorship, Archie. She has been waiting for the archive to burn so she can rise from the ashes as its owner, and Mr. Vance has been her silent partner. It's a double cross," I said, leaning against my desk. "Vance wants the real estate, and Thorne wants the collection. They've been using Marcus as the fall guy because he was already halfway to the bottom. But why the crimson bookmark? Why the theatrical blood? Because a bankruptcy is a legal transaction, but a desecration is a moral one," Wolfe said, his voice rising in volume. "If the public believes a madman or a desperate heir is targeting the archive, the pressure to dissolve the institution becomes irresistible. But Saul, what of the courier, the package that left Vance's house at 4:15 this morning?" "I followed it to a dock in Hoboken," Saul replied. "It wasn't a book, Mr. Wolfe. It was a crate of vintage wine destined for the gala, but I caught a glimpse of the manifest. Elena Thorne authorized the shipment, and tucked inside the straw of the crate was a crimson silk ribbon." Wolfe leaned back, the chair groaning under the weight of his revelation. "The sacrifice of the scholar. The victim is not Penhaligon. They are gala guests, a small, non-lethal dose of an irritant, perhaps, hidden in the wine, designed to cause a panic that will lead to the immediate closure of the archive by the Board of Health. A scandal so profound that the Sterling Hale name will be erased overnight. And in the chaos, the Chaucerian fragment will be found in Marcus Sterling's possession, provided to him by Dr. Thorne under the guise of an escape plan." "And the crimson bookmark?" I asked. "The ritual, a smokescreen," Wolfe snapped. "A way to keep us looking at the miller's tale while the real story was being written in the cellar. Dr. Thorne is no martyr. She is a chemist. She has used the cochineal dye and the iron gall ink to create a link between herself and the past, making her appear as a victim of the same intruder who is threatening the library. It is a masterful piece of psychological maneuvering. I sat at my desk and started making notes. The shadowed ledger gave us the money trail, and Saul's Hoboken trip gave us the method. We had the vulture in Julian Vance and the chemist in Elena Thorne, with Marcus Sterling playing the role of the sacrificial lamb. But we still had a displaced volume, the half-burned poison manual in Vance's furnace. "Vance didn't trust her," I said. "He burned the book because he realized she was going further than he intended. He wanted a land grab, she wanted a revolution. He's trying to cover his tracks before the gala starts. Which is why he came to me," Wolfe said, his eyes half closing. "He wanted me to find the intruder so he could point the finger at her before the poison was served. He realized he had invited a wolf into his own parlor, but he waited too long. The gala is tomorrow evening. Saul, back to the docks. I want that crate of wine intercepted. Do not call the police. Call Inspector Cramer and tell him I have a matter of grand larceny to discuss, but he is to meet me here, at this house, tomorrow at 6. And what about the guests in the dining room? I asked, jerking a thumb toward where Marcus was likely on his second bottle of rye. Mr. Sterling will remain our guest, Wolfe said, and we shall invite Dr. Thorne and Mr. Penhaligon to join him. We are going to have our own restoration, Archie. We are going to put the truth back together, piece by piece, and we are going to see which of our scholars survives the final chapter. Saul stood up, tipped his cap, and vanished back into the night. I looked at Wolfe, who was staring at the crimson bookmark on his desk as if it were a poisonous snake. The shadows were lengthening in the office, and the air felt cold. The shadowed ledger had told us the how and the who, but the why was still hanging in the air like the smell of old dust. Tomorrow was Friday, and the mystery of the crimson bookmark was about to reach its climax. I hoped Cramer was in a listening mood, because by the time we were done, the Sterling Hale archive was going to have a very different kind of history. Friday arrived with a sky so thick and grey it felt as though the city had been wrapped in dirty wool. Inside the brownstone, the atmosphere was heavier. Nero Wolfe had spent his morning session with the orchids in a silence so profound that Theodore Horseman had reportedly considered checking him for a pulse. By the time the elevator groaned its way down at 11, the office was prepared for the final movement of a very dangerous symphony. I had spent the morning on the telephone, playing the role of the social secretary for a man who considers the telephone a personal affront to his dignity. I had summoned Julian Vance, Dr. Elena Thorne, and Arthur Penhaligon to the office for 6 o'clock, using a tone that suggested that their attendance was not a request, but a subpoena from a higher power. The tightening spine of the case was visible in every corner of the room. Marcus Sterling was still tucked away in the dining room, looking like a man who had spent the night in a dryer and was now waiting for the final tumble. Saul Panzer had checked in twice, confirming that the intercepted crate of wine was now in a secure locker, and that Inspector Cramer was, as expected, in a state of high-octane irritation at being summoned to 35th Street on a gala night. I sat at my desk, checking the action on my Colt and watching Wolfe. He wasn't drinking beer. He was staring at the red silk bookmark, his fingers tracing the texture of the ribbon as if he were reading Braille. "The gala begins at 8, I said, checking my watch. Vance has already called twice. He's nervous, Wolfe. He wants to know if the sacrifice has been identified. He's ready to play the hero, but he doesn't know the script has been edited." "Mr. Vance is a man who believes that because he pays for the theatre, he also owns the actors," Wolfe replied, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "He does not realize that the most dangerous actor is the one who has spent her life in the shadows of the wings. Dr. Thorne has not merely been his partner, she has been his director. She provided the cochineal dye, the archaic ritual, and the manual for the toxins. She used his greed to mask her own obsession. She does not want the land, Archie. She wants the Sterling Hale to be hers, and hers alone, purified by a scandal that will leave her as the only person capable of restoring its name." "A scorched earth policy with a library card," I muttered. "But how do you prove the ledger Saul found is hers?" "She'll just say Vance planted it." "The proof is in the displacement, Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes half closing. "In the restoration lab you saw her hands. They were steady. A woman under the threat of a madman would be trembling. A woman who is in total control of the narrative is calm. But more importantly, the cochineal dye used on the silk is of a specific concentration used only in high-end restoration. It is as unique as a fingerprint. And I suspect that when Inspector Cramer arrives with the crate of wine, we will find that the irritant within is not a common chemical, but a botanical extract found only in the missing treatise on poisons." The afternoon stretched like a long, thin wire. At 5:30, the first of our guests arrived. Arthur Penhaligon looked like he was about to faint, his eyes darting toward the bookshelves as if the volumes themselves might leap off the shelves to accuse him. Julian Vance arrived 5 minutes later, silver-haired and arrogant, projecting an aura of concerned authority that made me want to kick him. He didn't sit. He paced the rug, his cane tapping a sharp, impatient rhythm. Finally, Dr. Elena Thorne arrived. She was perfectly composed, her hands folded over her handbag, her eyes neutral and observant. She took the chair I offered her with a slight nod of thanks, looking for all the world like a schoolteacher, waiting for a parent-teacher conference to begin. I brought Marcus Sterling from the dining room. The sight of the heir to the Sterling Hale name looking like a dishevelled wreck caused a momentary break in the room's tension. Vance's eyes narrowed, and Elena Thorne's fingers tightened slightly on her bag. The tightening spine was almost at breaking point. The stage was set, the suspects were gathered, and the only thing missing was the final witness. "Gentleman, Dr. Thorne," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that register of cold absolute authority, "we are here to discuss a theft, a threat, and a displacement of truth. You have all played your parts with varying degrees of competence. Mr. Vance, you have sought a fortune in real estate. Mr. Sterling, you have sought an escape from your debts. Mr. Penhaligon, you have sought a way to save your pride. But it is Dr. Thorne who has sought the ultimate prize, the total control of a legacy through the systematic destruction of its custodians." Elena Thorne didn't flinch. She looked at Wolfe with a cool, intellectual curiosity. "A fascinating accusation, Mr. Wolfe, but a library is built on evidence, not on the flamboyant theories of a man who does not leave his house. What evidence do you have to support this narrative of obsessive control?" "The evidence is currently being processed by the police, Doctor," Wolfe said, his eyes turning into slits of black light. "A crate of wine, a shadowed ledger, and a half-burned treatise on poisons. But more than that, the evidence is in this room. You see, a restorer understands that to fix a thing, you must first understand how it was broken. You have spent months breaking the Sterling Hale, piece by piece, so that you could be the only one to put it back together. You returned the Chaucerian fragment not as a prank, but as a test of the board's panic. And tonight you intended to use the gala to finalize the default. The doorbell rang, a heavy rhythmic pounding. I went to the door and let in Inspector Cramer. He was carrying a small glass vial and a look of grim satisfaction. He didn't say a word to the suspects. He walked straight to Wolfe's desk and placed the vial next to the crimson bookmark. The lab results on the wine came back. "Wolfe," Cramer barked, his eyes raking over the room. "It's aconite, in a concentration that wouldn't kill but would send 50 people to the hospital in a state of respiratory distress, and we found the bottle it came from in the Restoration Lab's chemical disposal unit. It had a crimson silk ribbon wrapped around the neck. The tightening spine snapped." Elena Thorne didn't scream, she didn't even stand up. She simply looked at the vial, and then at Julian Vance, a slow, mocking smile spreading across her face. Vance, however, had turned the colour of old parchment. He looked at Cramer, then at Wolfe, and I knew the mystery of the crimson bookmark had finally reached the final chapter. The ritual was over, the actors were unmasked, and the office was about to become a crime scene. I stood by the door, my hand on my gun, watching the scholars realize that their time in the dark was over. The office was now a theatre of silent, vibrating tension, the air thick with the smell of Wolfe's beer, the faint ozone of the city outside, and the sudden, sharp scent of panic. Inspector Cramer stood by the desk like a block of granite, his presence a blunt instrument in a room full of scalpels. Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk, his fingers interlaced over his abdomen, his eyes moving slowly from Julian Vance to Elena Thorne, with a look of profound, weary disappointment. He didn't seem to be looking at people. He was looking at the logical failures they represented. I stood by the door, feeling the weight of the cult and watching the shadows. The gathering in the office was complete, and the script was finally being read aloud for the benefit of the players who thought they were the authors. "Logic," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to fill the cracks in the silence, "is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of structure. You, Mr. Vance, built a structure of greed. You wished to acquire the Sterling Hale property, and to do so you needed the institution to fail. You entered into an alliance with Dr. Thorne, believing you were the architect. You provided the access. You financed the donations that Saul Panzer uncovered in your shadowed ledger, and you even indulged in the theatricality of the coal chute to ensure your private schemes remained private. But you are a man of ledgers and deeds. You are not a man of chemicals or history." Vance attempted to stand, his face a mask of purple indignation. "This is preposterous. I am a benefactor of that library. I have given millions to preserve. You have given millions to purchase a front-row seat to a liquidation," Wolfe snapped, the words hitting the room like stones. "Sit down, sir. Your indignation is as counterfeit as the hero of the gala role you intended to play tonight. You were prepared to discover the Chaucerian fragment and save the archive's reputation at the last moment, all while holding the bankruptcy papers in your other hand. But you did not explain your partner's ambition. Dr. Thorne did not want a liquidation. She wanted a crown. Elena Thorne sat perfectly still. She didn't look like a woman under accusation. She looked like a scholar who had found a fascinating error in a text. "A crown, Mr. Wolfe? I am a restorer. I work in the service of the past. You work in the service of an obsession," Wolfe countered. "You saw the archive failing under Penhaligon's timidity and Vance's greed. You decided that the only way to save the collection was to become its absolute master. To do that, you needed the board removed, the heirs discredited, and the current administration erased. The aconite in the wine was not meant to kill. It was meant to cause a public health scandal so profound that the state would be forced to revoke Sterling Hale's charter. In the ensuing chaos, you would have emerged as the only person with the expertise and the clean record to oversee the transition to a new private foundation, one funded by the very accounts Saul discovered in Switzerland. "And the bookmark?" Marcus Sterling asked, his voice cracking. "The sacrifice was intended to be Mr. Penhaligon," Wolfe said, gesturing toward the trembling curator. "He was to be found in his office tonight, having apparently committed suicide out of shame for the theft and the poisoning. A bottle of aconite, taken from the displaced volume's instructions, would have been found in his desk. Crimson bookmarks would have been his final signature. A tragic end for a man who could not live with his failure. It was a tidy ending, Dr. Thorne, but you were too precise. The cochineal dye on the silk was a restorer's dye. The iron gall ink was a restorer's ink. You could not help but leave your fingerprint on the ritual." Inspector Cramer stepped forward, his jaw set. "We've got the ledger, Doctor, and we've got the statements from the Hoboken dock workers who saw you supervising that crate. They've already identified your photograph. And as for the aconite, the lab found traces of it on your lab coat during the preliminary search of your apartment an hour ago. You were a little too confident in your chemical disposal unit." The room seemed to shrink. Julian Vance looked at Elena Thorne with a mixture of horror and realization. He had thought he was using a tool. He discovered he had been dancing with a predator. You were going to poison the donors? My friends? People I've known for 40 years? "They aren't people to her, Mr. Vance," I said from the door. "They're just ink on a page that needs to be erased. She's been fixing the past so long she forgot that the present doesn't like being edited with poison." Elena Thorne finally stood up. She didn't look at Vance, and she didn't look at Cramer. She looked at Wolfe. "A library is a living thing, Mr. Wolfe. It requires a singular vision to survive the rot of men like these. I did what was necessary to preserve the Sterling Hale from being turned into a parking lot or a gambling fund. If I have failed, it is only because I underestimated the persistence of a man who lives in a room full of flowers. You did not underestimate me," Wolfe said, his voice unusually soft. "You underestimated the truth. It is the only manuscript that cannot be restored to fit a new narrative. Archie, the doors. I believe the inspector has seen enough of our office theatre for one night." Cramer didn't need a second invitation. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had a lot of paperwork ahead of him, taking Elena Thorne by the arm. She went quietly, her head held high, leaving a silence in the office that felt like the end of a long, dusty era. Julian Vance followed, his silver-headed cane tapping a hollow, defeated rhythm on the floorboards, with Marcus Sterling slinking behind him like a beaten dog. Arthur Penhaligon was the last to leave, looking at Wolfe with a mixture of gratitude and terror before vanishing into the night. The office was suddenly large again and very quiet. The gathering was over. The bookmarks were now just evidence, and the Chaucerian fragment was back in the hands of the law. I walked to my desk and picked up the red silk ribbon. It was just a piece of fabric, but it had almost been a shroud. "Well," I said, looking at Wolfe, "the restoration is complete. I hope the archive likes its new history because the old one just went up in smoke." Wolfe didn't answer. He reached for the button on his desk and rang for Fritz. "Archie, I believe we have missed our dinner. Tell Fritz that the lamb is to be served immediately, and tell him I want no silk on the table, only linen. I have had quite enough of the colour red." I went to the kitchen, feeling the tightening spine of the case finally relax. The mystery of the crimson bookmark was over, and the final chapter had been written in the only ink that matters. Wolfe was right. The truth is a stubborn thing, and it doesn't need cochineal dye to make its mark. The office was finally empty of the literati, but the smell of old paper and new betrayal lingered in the air like a persistent fog. Inspector Cramer had departed with his prisoners, one a vulture in a bespoke suit, and the other a visionary who had mistaken a library for a laboratory of human suffering. The front door had clicked shut for the final time that evening, leaving the brownstone to its natural state of heavy intellectual silence. I stood by the window for a minute, watching the red and blue lights of the police cars fade into the New York night. It was barely 8 o'clock, the exact time the gala was supposed to have begun uptown. Instead of a ballroom full of tuxedoed donors and chilled champagne, there was a dark building on East 62nd Street and a series of very uncomfortable conversations waiting for the Sterling Hale Board of Trustees. I turned back to the room and saw Nero Wolfe exactly where I had left him. He hadn't moved a muscle since Elena Thorne had been led away. He was leaning back in his chair, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity, his eyes closed. To anyone else he would have looked like he was napping, but I knew better. He was mentally filing the case away, putting the mystery of the crimson bookmark into the deep storage of his memory. On his desk, the small silk ribbon looked insignificant now, just a scrap of fabric that had failed to become a noose. The Chaucerian fragment was in a police evidence bag, and the displaced volume of Poisons was a pile of ash in Julian Vance's furnace. The final chapter of Sterling Hale's descent into bankruptcy had been unwritten, replaced by a messy public scandal that would likely save the books even if it destroyed the men. "Well," I said, dropping into my chair and pulling the typewriter toward me, "the restoration is done, but I don't think the archive is going to be sending us a thank you note. We've turned their benefactor into a felon and their head restorer into a chemist for the prosecution. I hope Marcus Sterling likes the taste of humble pie, because that's about all he has left to eat." Wolfe opened one eye, but he didn't look at me. He looked at the empty beer glass on his tray. "The archive, Archie, is a collection of inanimate objects. It does not feel gratitude, nor does it suffer from scandal. It merely exists. It was the humans who sought to wrap their own failings in its prestige who have been dismantled. Dr. Thorne was correct about one thing: a singular vision is required to preserve the past. But she forgot that the vision must be clear, not clouded by the red mist of obsession. She was a cool customer," I said, thinking of how she had smiled on the evidence. If she'd been born 500 years ago, She probably would have been running a kingdom or poisoning a pope. She had more steel in her pinky finger than Julian Vance had in his whole silver-headed cane. I almost feel sorry for Penhaligon. He's going to have to find a new villain to hide behind, and I don't think there are many left in that basement. Mr. Penhaligon is a man who prefers the company of the dead because they do not ask for a manual bypass of his conscience, Wolfe remarked. He will survive. He will be hailed as the man who stayed at his post while the wolves were at the door, and he will believe it himself by the time the next endowment is raised. It is the final chapter of the scholar's vanity, to believe that his own survival is a victory for the truth. I started typing reports, rhythmic clicking of keys filling the office. In Nero Wolfe's world, the report is the only thing that truly lasts. It's the final accounting, the place where the logic is pinned down and the facts are polished. I wrote about the cochineal die, the shadowed ledger, and the way the aconite was intended to turn a gala into a crime scene. I wrote about silver pins and tailors that didn't exist. It was a long story for such a small bookmark, but then again, most tragedies start with a very small displacement. What happens to the fragment now? I asked, over the sound of the carriage returning. Does it go back to the vault? Or does the state take it as evidence until Marcus Sterling gets through his next poker game? The state has no claim to the Chaucer, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of cold authority. It is a cultural treasure, not a weapon. Once the prosecution has its photographs and its testimony, the fragment will return to the archive. But I suspect the archive will no longer be on East 62nd Street. With Vance in prison and the Sterling Hale name in the headlines, the property will be sold to settle the debts. The past will be moved to a more modest home, perhaps a university or a public museum where it can be studied without the interference of real estate speculators. A happy ending for the dead skin, I muttered. I'll tell Saul to expect a bonus for the Hoboken trip. He earned it tonight. If he hadn't found that wine crate, we'd be spending the night at the hospital instead of the office. Wolfe didn't answer. He reached out and rang the bell for Fritz. The signal was clear, the case was closed, the report was in progress, and the master of the house was ready to return to his primary occupation, the consumption of a perfect meal. I watched him stand up, a slow and momentous movement that suggested the mountain was finally finished with the theatre of the morning. He headed for the dining room without a word, his shoulders set, his mind already miles away from the Sterling Hale and its crimson ribbons. I finished the last page of the report and pulled it from the typewriter. I looked at the red bookmark one last time before I tucked it into the evidence envelope. It was just a scrap of silk, but it had brought the brownstone to a standstill for 4 days. I turned out the lights in the office, leaving the room in the soft, warm glow of the hallway lamp. The final chapter had been unwritten, the ritual had been broken, and the only thing left was the sound of the city outside and the smell of roasting lamb from the kitchen. The archive was safe, the vulture was caged, and the scholar had been sacrificed to the only thing that truly matters in this house, the truth. The brownstone on West 35th Street had finally returned to its natural state of rhythmic intellectual grace. The January wind was still trying to find a way through the window casings, but the interior of the house was a sanctuary of filtered air and deliberate silence. Nero Wolfe had spent his morning session with the orchids as if the mystery of the crimson bookmark had never existed, and the only evidence of the week's disturbances was the final report sitting on my desk, waiting for its place in the filing cabinet. It was 11 o'clock Saturday morning, and the elevator had just delivered the master of the house to the ground floor. He emerged with his usual measured pace, navigated the hallway, and settled into his specially reinforced chair. He spent several minutes adjusting his blotter and checking the alignment of his pens. To anyone else it might have looked like a man being fussy about his desk, but I knew it was a ritual of restoration. Wolfe was putting his world back together, piece by piece, ensuring that the logic of his environment was once again intact. He didn't look at me, and he didn't ask for a beer. He simply stared at the space where the crimson bookmark had sat for the last 4 days. "Archie," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to settle the air in the room. "Is the correspondence cleared? The desk is as clean as a whistle, and the bank deposit is ready for the Monday run," I replied, leaning back in my swivel chair. "Julian Vance's lawyers are already trying to negotiate a settlement, and Marcus Sterling has reportedly left the city for a climate that is more conducive to his health and less conducive to his creditors. As for Arthur Penhaligon, he called this morning to thank you for saving the soul of the archive. I told him you were busy with the Miltonia and that he should send the final installment of the fee to the usual address." Wolfe made a sound of mild acknowledgement, a grunt that expressed a total lack of interest in Penhaligon's gratitude. "The soul of the archive," Wolfe murmured, the words tasting like sour wine. "A charmingly academic delusion. Mr. Penhaligon remains a man who believes that keeping ink on parchment is equivalent to preserving virtue. He fails to realize that integrity is not found in the vault, it is found in the hand that holds the key." "Well, he's got the keys back now," I said, "and I don't think he'll be sharing the codes with anyone named Thorne or Vance for a long, long time. But what about Chaucer, Wolfe? Do you think it was worth the trouble? All that blood and ritual for a fragment of a story that was written 600 years ago?" Wolfe reached out and touched the arm of his chair, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "The Chaucer, Archie, is a record of human folly, human appetite, and human resilience. It is a masterpiece of insight, but it is merely paper. The trouble was not for the manuscript, the trouble was for the principle of the thing. A library is a place where the truth is meant to be protected from the distortions of the present. When Dr. Thorne used the past as a weapon to edit the present, she committed a crime against the very foundation of civilization. She sought to restore the world to fit her own obsession. She was a good restorer, though, I noted. That iron gall ink recipe was a perfect match. If you hadn't seen the displacement, we might still be looking for a ghost in the stacks. A restorer's greatest temptation is to believe that they can improve upon the original," Wolfe remarked, his eyes half closing. "She didn't want to save the Sterling Hale, she wanted to rewrite it. She wanted to remove the stains of greed represented by Vance and the blots of incompetence represented by Penhaligon, replacing them with her own singular vision. But integrity, Archie, is not a matter of a singular vision. It is a matter of acknowledging the stains and the blots as part of the narrative." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face bright with the knowledge that the office was finally clear of the literati. He was carrying a tray with 2 bottles of beer and a bowl of fresh walnuts. He set them down on the desk with a slight bow and retreated to the kitchen, where I knew he was preparing a lunch that would require no silk ribbons or theatrical blood. Wolfe poured a glass of beer, watching the foam rise with the intensity of a man who found more truth in a perfect head of foam than in a dozen Chaucerian fragments. "Ink and integrity," Wolfe said, lifting the glass. "They are both permanent, provided they are applied with a steady hand. If the hand wavers, the ink becomes a blot, and the integrity becomes a mask. We have spent the week correcting a blot, Archie. Nothing more. A blot with a 5-figure fee," I added, spinning the bank deposit slip on my finger. "I'll take that kind of proofreading any day of the week. I'll get this report filed, and then I'm going for a walk. I need some New York air that hasn't been filtered through a 17th century poison manual." "A walk is a reasonable pursuit," Wolfe said, opening a book on his desk, "provided you do not return with any bibliographical urgencies. I have had quite enough of the Sterling Hale and its crimson markers. I find I have a profound need for a narrative that stays on the page." I stood up and stretched, my joints popping after a week of pavement pounding and office gathering. I looked at Wolfe one last time before I headed for the door. He was already deep in his book, the mountain having finally retreated back into his private world of words and orchids. The mystery of the crimson bookmark was over, the ritual was broken, and the brownstone was once again a place where the only thing that mattered was the logic of the next meal. I walked out into the cold New York morning, feeling the weight of the case lift from my shoulders. The archive was safe, the scholars were unmasked, and in the house on West 35th Street, the truth had finally been put back on the shelf, right where it belonged.